Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. It looks like there's a small hiccup in our stream. I think we should be back now. Fantastic. It looks great. Okay, so welcome. It's so great to see everyone again today. Today, what we're going to be doing is talking a little bit about the core differences between a French press brewed coffee and a pour over brewed coffee, right? Maybe you're a diehard French press fan and you're sort of curious about what all this talk about why pour over coffee is so great. Or maybe you're only making pour overs at home. It's been a super long time since you've had a French press, and you want to think a little bit more about if you wanted to bring that back into your coffee routine. Well, today I want to talk about the science of some of how this brews and also talk a little bit more about what you can expect out of the cup from both a French press style coffee and a pour over style coffee. To get started, the first thing we have to really think about when you're talking about brewing coffee is the realization that whenever you're brewing coffee, all you're really doing is adding hot water to this roasted seed to pull out all the flavors that you want, right? Now, in reality, we could do this just with hot water and ground coffee alone. That's just a part of a thing that you can do to brew coffee. In fact, most professional coffee tasters, like green coffee buyers, when they're purchasing coffee, they're doing it using this methodology called cupping, which just involves taking ground coffee, putting it into a bowl, adding hot water, and then slurping out the brewed coffee out of it with a spoon. It's an easy way to taste a lot of different coffees all at once. Now, if we want to drink our coffee at home, we probably wouldn't take it that way because it's a little bit more labor intensive. It's a little messy, and you still might end up with ground coffee in your spoon or in your cup, right? So that's why we introduce a filtering method. And all coffee brewers generally have a filtering method of some kind that keeps out that roasted coffee stuff out of your liquid coffee that you're drinking and enjoying. With that, oh hey Mina, I seem a little bit fuzzy today. It's possible that our stream is just a little bit on the fuzzier side. We're trying out something that's a little lower latency, which means that I can respond to the chat a little bit faster. So the quality might be a little less sort of perfect, but hopefully it's still really solid and fun. Oh, perfect. It's much better now. Great. Okay, so back to our conversation about brewing. All brewers tend to have a filtering method or a way to filter out that roasted coffee out of the liquid that we want to enjoy, that delicious cup of brewed coffee. Now, when we think about it though, there's a lot of different ways to filter out that roasted coffee. And so this is where some of the key differences between a French press and other styles of brewers are. So when you think about a French press, when we think about filtering, it has, if you can see, this wire mesh filter that keeps your roasted coffee out. But there's some pretty big holes in there, and those holes are large enough for a lot of small coffee particles and oils to pass right through and into our cup, right? Now, on the other hand, if we look at a filter from a pour-over brewer like this Kalita, you can't really see through it as clearly, right? It's gonna have a lot more ability to keep anything that was in that roasted coffee out except for the liquid that's passing through. It's gonna be harder for smaller pieces of coffee to make it into our cup. And we know this is a big thing. If you've had a French press at home, I'm sure you've tasted it and you've had that little bit of just coffee sludge that kind of sits at the bottom of your cup. That's a big piece of what a French press is there for. It's letting all of that particulate through. And so when that particulate is in the cup, it actually does something really interesting. It increases the sensation of body. And really, any filtering method is going to have an impact on two key variables. One is body, and the other one is clarity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, body is that sensation on your palate of how heavy or sort of rich something feels, right? A good example of something with a really heavy body, right, is like a stout or a milkshake, something that's nice and thick and creamy, right? Now on the other end, something that has a super light body might be something like water or tea, right? Just sort of is there, it doesn't really feel like much on your palate, on your tongue, right? On the other end of the spectrum, though, we have this thing we call clarity. And with clarity, what that means is how easy is it for you to taste individual flavors inside of the thing you're consuming, right? So if I'm thinking about clarity in a cup of coffee, my biggest thing that I'd be considerate of is how easy is it for me. Hi, Brendan. It's so nice to see you, Brendan Leahy. Thank you so much for joining us today. When I think about clarity and coffee, I'm thinking about how easy is it for me to taste individual notes. Nancy, hi as well. Thank you guys so much for chatting too. Also, please feel free to interact on the chat, add any questions you have in. I'm really excited to talk coffee and answer any questions you might have about filtering and brewing, French press versus Kalita. That's what we're here for. Clarity, again, is that sensation of being able to taste individual notes on a coffee, right? If you've ever looked at a bag of coffee and has tasting notes on it, if a brew method has a lot of clarity to it, you're going to be able to have an easier time tasting the individual notes that are on those bags. Now, what about the big difference between a French press and a pour over when it comes to body and clarity? Well, I want to talk about that in our nice overhead view right here. All right, so as we're thinking through body and clarity, ooh, Loud, it's nice to see you. Hashtag French press fan, loving it. Well, for your French presses, you'll be happy to hear that on this matrix, which is showing body and clarity, there is a French press that's usually going to sit right around here. And what I mean by that is that usually when we think about body and clarity, there's an inverse relationship, right? If something has more body, it might have less clarity of flavor. That makes sense to me if you think about it, again, using the milkshake metaphor, right? If something has a really heavy body, if something has a lot of texture to it, it can be harder for our tongue to decipher all the different things that are going on in it. I like to think of it as a thing that has a lot of body as sort of like a really crowded party. Which I can't wait to go back to crowded parties at some point in the near future. But anyway, a French press is like having this really crowded party. There's a lot of things in there. There's a lot of stuff jam-packed in, and it's harder to have individual conversations with people at a crowded party than it is if you're in a restaurant that has more space maybe and fewer people. And so when you have a lot of body, it's going to be harder to detect those individual flavors. Now, if we think about a French press again, because it's got that really, really open filtering methodology, it's got that wire mesh like this that allows a lot of things through, it increases the sensation of body. So a French press, again, is going to be on the higher end of the body, but on the lower end of the clarity. Oh, yes, body is up here. As body decreases, increases clarity. Yeah, this makes sense. We'll work with it. Body and clarity. It should actually be like yeah, we're fine. So anyway, so a French press has a lot of body, not a lot of clarity, right? But the more clarity you have over here, the less body you're going to experience. And that's true with this, right? There's fewer things passing through this. There are fewer actual small pieces of coffee that are being broken down in the water that are getting through your Kalita or your pour over filter. And that means that it's going to be less intense on the body spectrum. It's going to be over here, right? We'll say pour over, right? Now, if you want something that has a ton of body, if you're looking for something that is really rich and super tasty and heavy bodied, and kind of concentrated, a French press is a great way to go. I bet Loud can attest to this as well if you're a big French press fan. If you're a huge pour over fan, chances are you prefer something that's a little lighter in body, but maybe has a lot of clarity of flavor. You're looking to kind of do that investigative work of digging in and tasting the individual notes. On the other hand, if you really, really, really are wanting kind of the best of both worlds, oftentimes something you can do is use a stainless steel filter for your pour over brewer. There's a couple really fantastic ones that are out there. I really like the Cone filter for a Chemex. It is spelled Kone. When you put that in, it's sort of a combination of both that French press style metal filter that allows a little bit more through, but the holes are much smaller, so less comes through, so you still get a fair amount of clarity, right? Generally speaking, a cone is going to fit somewhere right around here. That's that sort of stainless filter, even though that looks like Stanley Tucci. It really says stainless filter. Now, what about the big deal, though, about how these coffees brew? Because obviously, a French press is going to brew really differently than a pour-over, right? The process is significantly different. With a French press, for instance, all we're really doing is adding the ground coffee in, adding hot water, letting it steep for a while, and then pushing down the ground coffee all the way to the bottom and then pouring out the liquid coffee. A pour over, on the other hand, a bit more labor intensive, right? You're going to be taking ground coffee, putting it into a filter or into a pour over like this once you have a filter in, and then manually pouring hot water over the top so the water passes through that bed of coffee. Big thing that's different between the two, though, is temperature. Now, when we think about temperature, we think about how it impacts our brew, because the hotter our water is, the hotter our brewing environment is, the quicker things will get pulled out of our roasted coffee. How that means for a French press, though, is that if you look at it, this French press has glass walls, it's got a lot of surface area, and it's got a big sort of brewing environment where we're going to be putting our hot water in. The unfortunate thing is, though, with this major amount of surface area on the sides, we're going to be losing temperature much more quickly. These things actually brew a little bit colder than you would most of your home coffee machines or home brewers if you're not using hot water, right? Why that makes a big deal, though, or why that makes a big impact, is that it can have the potential of, especially for some lighter roasted coffees, not pulling enough of that flavor out. If you remember last week, we talked a little bit about how roast profile impacts the way that coffee brews. And the more roasted a coffee is, the easier it is for it to break down in water and start giving up its flavors to us. The lighter a coffee is roasted, the more difficult it is generally for that water to pull the flavors out of it. We have to kind of work harder. With a French press, since where temperature is lower, it is less effective at breaking down that coffee into the beverage we want. So with that, generally I recommend, if you like medium or dark roasted coffees, a French press can be a fantastic investment. It can be really great, especially if you like those heavy bodied coffees, right? On the other hand, if you think about pour over brewed coffee, like this one right here, we're adding in water and we have a little bit more control over the environment. And because there's less water coming in and it's coming from generally a really hot kettle and it's being introduced slowly over time, that water tends to be hotter and it tends to be much more effective at breaking down lighter roasted coffee. So again, if you like your dark roast, you like heavy body, French press all the way. If you like something that's a little bit lighter, you like something a little bit more delicate, a little bit more nuanced, you probably want to pour over, right? There's some in betweens too. There's some other brewers out there. I'm always curious. If you guys are in the chat, let me know what are your favorite brewers to use as well. And I'm going to go forward with the next piece for us to talk about, which is some of the mechanics of doing this. So again, we've talked a little bit about the joys of using a French press from a body perspective. Now let's talk a little bit about the process of making one, right? I'm curious if anyone has a favorite French press methodology. Please drop that in the chat. I'm going to talk about mine. My favorite way to make a French press is generally to be adding my coffee in, and then I'll use a scale and I'll weigh out about 25 to 30 grams of ground coffee, depending on how much brewed coffee I want, right? Add the ground coffee in, and this is very coarsely ground coffee. Now, why coarsely ground? Well, because we don't want a ton of coffee stuff getting through this filter, and so if it's more coarsely ground, it's going to be much more difficult for it to pass through the filter and into our cup. I'll be adding my coarsely ground coffee into here. If I add 25 grams, which we'll use for this recipe, ostensibly, I would add 25 grams into here, and then I'm going to add some hot water. Now, I'm going to be brewing directly onto a scale generally when I make a French press, and that's because I want to know exactly how much ground coffee to water I'm using. A couple weeks ago, we talked about brew ratios, right? And if you use a brew ratio of about 1 to 16, meaning 1 part ground coffee to 16 parts water, you're going to get a pretty dang good cup of coffee, generally 9 times out of 10. So if I have 25 grams of ground coffee, I'm going to use about 410 total grams of water to brew. Now, when I first start brewing, though, the temptation could be just to pour it all in at once and then just let it steep. Instead, what I usually do to make a really fantastic French press is I'm going to add about twice the weight of my ground coffee and water. So about 50 grams of water first, and then I'm going to stir it up. And it's not just because I love Bob Marley, it's because stirring it up does this really great thing of saturating that bed in its entirety. You're able to get that water in and make sure there's no dry pockets. Ooh, Daniel Moore. James Hoffman's French press method is so delicious, but it takes forever. Maybe that's perfect for these strange times. That's fantastic. Thank you, Daniel, for that. Yeah, if you're a huge French press fan, I would definitely recommend, maybe Daniel, you can pull it up and drop a link in the chat to James Hoffman's French press technique. It's a little bit lengthy. He uses some of the skills that green coffee buyers use in cupping to help improve that clarity of flavor by removing some of the particulate. It's a really interesting and lengthy process. But back to my recipe that's a little bit simpler. It's just the 25 grams in, 50 grams of water, give it a good stir. Once you hit the water, ground coffee with water, start a timer because we're shooting for a 4-minute brew time. So adding the water in, we've bloomed it, we've done that twice the weight, we've stirred it up, and then you add some more water back in until you hit your brew weight, your total volume, which is going to be about 400 grams in my recipe. Once that's done, you just let it sit. Put the filter just into the top. Don't compress it all the way, just let it sit there, because what this does is helps it retain temperature. By putting a lid on top like this, it makes sure that the heat isn't escaping out as easily. It's sort of creating this internal thing. Ooh, Robin, thank you. The thermal French press you have, you like a lot because it doesn't get cold. There are some really great French presses out there that have double insulated walls. It helps that temperature stability significantly. If you have a Bodum French press like this, you're missing out on some of that temperature stability, but you can generally find any of the thermal double-walled French presses too. Great point, Robin. So with the French press, once you've got the lid in, you've got your coffee and your water set, you're at your brew weight, everything's looking great, just let it sit. Let it sit for a full 4 minutes. Once it hits that 4 minutes, you're gonna take your hand and slowly depress the plunger, right? You don't wanna just jam it down, you're not making this a race. You just wanna have it go down slow enough. By the weight of your hand, it shouldn't have too much resistance, because if there's a ton of resistance, it usually means that there's some coffee blockages and you might be putting a little bit too much pressure on that wire mesh filter. Once you're done though, I would decant the coffee, meaning I would pour out all of the coffee. If you have a thermal carafe, that's a great thing to do. If you can pour it into a thermal carafe, all the better. Generally though, after about 5-ish minutes, the coffee is still steeping a little bit, but with it sitting at the bottom, it's really doing most of its extraction, most of its brewing down in the bottom. You're not gonna worry too much about over extraction. Now, if you let your French press sit for hours, for instance, if you're sipping on it for 2 or 3 hours, it might start picking up some of that woody flavor that comes from roasted coffee, but it's not going to have an overwhelmingly negative sensation. That said, if you decant your coffee right after brewing it into a thermal carafe or into like a travel mug that's heated and insulated, you're going to get a much higher quality coffee for longer, and it's not going to pick up as much of that kind of woody flavor that you would get if you're letting it steep for a long time. Now, pour over wise, there's a ton of pour over technique out there, and we're actually going to be producing some videos for this channel that's just simple recipes and tutorials on how to brew using a pour over style setup, specifically looking at things like the Kalita Wave, the V60, and the Chemex, because those are 3 of our favorite ways to brew on a pour over style brewer. That said, the general idea is really similar. The only major differences are that you're going to need a little bit extra in terms of equipment. So 1, you're going to need a brewer, just like with a French press, you needed a brewer. And 2, you're going to need a filtering device of some kind, right? Generally, filter paper is going to be what you're using for most pour-over style brewers. The third thing that's really important is a scale. Talked about that a lot. If you have a kitchen scale at home, it makes it so much easier to get consistent results with your brewed coffee. And the fourth thing that makes it a bit easier is having something like a gooseneck style kettle. Now these are kettles that have a longer spout. They give you a little bit more control over how the water is falling out of the kettle onto your ground coffee. Is it essential for a pour over? Absolutely not. You don't need it to make pour over brewed coffee. It's really just makes it significantly easier to control how that water comes in, because you don't want to generally blast your pour over brew with a ton of water right away, because then the water just pushes the coffee up and it goes through the coffee a little too quickly. It doesn't have enough time to really pull out the flavors that you want, break down that coffee in a way that's really lovely. So with that, you're going to need those 4 things: brewer, filter paper, a scale, please, and a gooseneck kettle or a specialized kettle for pour over brewing. Same idea though, it's a 1:16 ratio. You use 1 part ground coffee to 16 parts water. And then feel free to brew in there as needed. Generally, you're looking for a 3 to 4 minute brew time. You're gonna have a bloom cycle. Again, keep an eye on this channel. We'll have some really great tutorial videos on how to brew coffee in a pour over brewer. That said, I want to say thank you guys so much for joining us today as we talked about French press and pour over brewed coffee. If you're curious about learning more, my amazing colleague Scott Klepper, who's our coffee educator, has put together a fantastic blog that'll be coming up shortly on our website, which you can see right here, with some specific tips about the differences and how to brew on a French press and on a pour over style brewer. The other thing that I'd like to call out real quick is that today's coffee that I'm sipping on is the fantastic seasonal coffee we have called 32 Women. It's an amazing coffee that is brought to us by the fantastic folks at Sustainable Harvest. If you're interested in picking up some of this fantastic coffee produced by an amazing cooperative, go to our website. There should be a link in the description below, or you can just go to portlandcoffeeroasters.com, and our coffee, the seasonal coffee, is on the front page. You can learn a little bit more about all the cool things going on with 32 Women as a coffee, how it's specifically highlighting the work of some of the fantastic women who grow the coffee within the cooperative, Union Ife, which this coffee comes from. Beyond that, I just want to say thank you guys so much for joining us today. Thank you again, Brendan, Nancy, Loud, Daniel, and Robin, and Mina. It's lovely seeing you all. And feel free again to leave any questions you have in the comments section. We'll be happy to answer them. Or you can always email us to video@portlandroasting is a great email to get to us if you're curious about anything coffee related. We're here to help. Thank you again so much. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day, and I hope you guys stay curious, stay caffeinated, and stay safe. Thanks so much.